I am also a researcher. So I have recently submitted my doctoral thesis at the Center for Himalayan Studies in the University of North Bengal, Siliguri. And my work largely focuses on labor migration, that is mobility of a particular group of laborers from Nepal who migrate and work in various hill towns of Darjeeling Hills, Kalimpong, Kurseong, and nearby regions. And that is where I sort of got my interest in understanding the migration of a particular laboring group. And my work majorly focuses on the potters, who are referred to as bhariyas, namle, and even kuli in Nepali language. So when we talk about migration and labor in the Eastern Himalayas, I am sure that a lot of us who are present here, they know about this topic very deeply, and they know how migration started, how migration changed the socioeconomic aspect of the region, how it changed the total landscape, right? And it would not be wrong to say that the history of Darjeeling Hills or even Sikkim Himalayas is not complete without sort of understanding the history of migration and labor. So when we talk about the socioeconomic background, the socioeconomic history of the region, the topic of migration and labor comes up. When we talk about the political aspect or political history of the region, the topic of migration and labor comes up. So that is why, to understand Darjeeling, to understand Kalimpong, Sikkim, the Eastern Himalayas altogether, the topic of migration and labor cannot be neglected, because it is sort of intertwined within the history of the region itself. So the need to talk about migration and labor in today's exhibition is also sort of very interesting, in the sense that the exhibition itself is based on that aspect of labor and migration, how people migrated from Nepal, how they came to Darjeeling, and how they were recruited in high altitude mountaineering porterage, and how they were also, they worked as cook, they worked as interpreters, they worked as sardars, right? So that is why it is very important to sort of understand the whole history of labor migration in the context of this exhibition as well. So when we look at the history of labor migration in the region, there are studies, lot of studies, research that says that labor migration in the region started in the late 18th century and in the early 19th century as well. So this is sort of a documented migration, but I'd also like to point out here is that the fact that before this documented migration started, people used to move from one place to another in the Eastern Himalayas. So I would not sort of press upon the fact that migration between Nepal and Darjeeling, or migration between Nepal and Sikkim Himalayas, started in the late 18th centuries, right? But I would like to sort of point it out that this kind of migration should be regarded as documented, structured migration, because people, even before the late 18th century, when the documented structured migration happened, people used to move from one place to another, right? Maybe our ancestors during that time, they did not have the idea of hard borders the way we have today, right? So we know that we are crossing one state, or the border of state, we are crossing the country's border. But back then, our ancestors, they did not have that concept of hard borders. So for them, it was just going from one place to another, because they were also involved in trans-Himalayan trade. They used to bring rice from one place and go and bring salt from the other. So they used to have this idea of moving from one place to another, and it was sort of ingrained in the everyday life of these individuals back then. But the documented structured migration sort of started happening once the colonial rulers, they came up in the region, right? Documented in the sense that they started writing about this migration, they started writing about the laborers, and structured in the sense that there were streams of migration that happened in, for instance, in the tea plantation. There were migrants who used to come here and go to the expeditions, or there were British army recruitment that happened in the region. So that is why I sort of term this kind of migration as documented, structured migration, which started in the late 18th and the early 20th centuries. So it was sort of a deliberate, policy on the part of the British rulers to recruit from the most sort of remote regions of the adjoining regions of Nepal, especially from Central Hills and even the Eastern Himalayas, the eastern part of Nepal as well. And it served them with the supply of cheap force of, labor from these villages of Nepal. And if you are to look at the where the streams of labor migration, first we can sort of look it in the context of how British army recruitment happened, where we can go back as early as 1815, when young Nepali men, they used to come from Nepal, different villages of Nepal, and they would be recruited from Darjeeling. So Darjeeling was also a center of recruitment for the Gorkha soldiers, right? And one of the interesting fact of this recruitment is the segregation method that the Britishers followed. So it was not only, the recruitment was not only open for all the young Nepali men, but also they had to belong to certain caste group, right? For instance, we had Magadhs and Gurungs, who used to come from Central Hills of Nepal. Then we had Rais and Limbus, they used to come from the eastern part of Nepal. So these caste groups were considered as martial character, or they were also seen as warrior gentlemen, right? So to be recruited in the British army, you had to belong to certain castes like Magadhs, Gurungs, or Rais, or Limbus. And one of the interesting fact of this recruitment is also how these young Nepali men arrived in the region. So it was they had this agents, they had the middlemen, or they were popularly termed as Gallawalas. So these Gallawalas, what they used to do is, they used to go to the interiors of Nepal and they used to bring young Nepali men, right? So if I am a Rai Gallawala, I used to go to the village where Rai population dominated, and from there I used to bring. And similarly with Magar Gallawalas, they used to go to the villages in Nepal which was dominated by Magar, and similarly with Gurung Limbus, it happened in that way, right? So this was one stream of migration. The second kind of migration that happened, which is very important and most of us are aware of it, which happened towards the tea plantation, right? So an experimental growth, it started in Darjeeling, started around the 1839 to 1841. So over this period, a lot of people started coming to the tea plantation to work for the colonial rulers. And by around 30, after 30 years, I think 41, okay, 20 to 30 years, around 1860s, around 5,000 acres of tea plantation land was covered, and there was around 13 tea gardens that had been established by the end of 1866. So you can just imagine the amount of migration that had happened over the period of from 1830s to 1860s. And so these migrations sort of continued over this period of time. So one of the interesting factor of this kind of migration in the tea plantation was the very fact that the British colonial rulers, they encouraged family migration, unlike the army recruitment. So what happened here is that the Britishers, they wanted a continuous supply of cheap labor. So what they did was they encouraged the whole family to migrate, and to also not only migrate but also to settle in these very plantations, right? So another important fact is that the fact behind sort of encouraging family migration is the fact that they wanted the women to come and work in the region, right? Because if women were the laborers, if women, they also migrate, what they could do was they could they could give birth to the coming generation of, cheap laborers. So that is why they encourage women, and as well as children, they were allowed to sort of work. They were encouraged, not allowed, but they were encouraged to work under the chokora system, where the children up to, I think, age 14, they were, they could work in the tea plantation, right? Okay, so this was another stream of migration that happened in the tea plantation region. So these two type of migration, the migration for, recruitment in the British Army, and the second type of migration towards the tea plantation, that was sort of that happened in a large scale, I would say. But there was another kind of labor migration that was happening in the region, which was sort of neglected even in the various literatures and research as well. What I'm also trying to look through my thesis is the presence of seasonal migrants, who were also very, very crucial for the, colonial rulers to build the infrastructure, right? For instance. So what happened was, these seasonal migrants, they did not, of course, settle permanently like the tea plantation laborers did, but they used to come to the region for like 2 to 3 months, or 4 to 5 months during the winter season, especially, which they refer to as Hyudo Mahina. And they used to sort of work in their fields in Nepal for larger part of the year. And then after planting, they used to come back, they used to come to Darjeeling and look for wage employments when there was no work in the land agricultural back in Nepal. So once the work would be completed in Darjeeling, they would go back to Nepal during the harvest season. So this kind of labor migration also used to happen, which has been sort of neglected in various, literatures and work. So these laborers, they used to come to Darjeeling, and they used to work, for instance, for building the Himalayan railways, for construction of Himalayan railways, for construction of the roadways, the various administrative buildings that was required for the, the European elites, the British colonizers. They also build recreational centers, they build schools, they build hospitals, they build sanatoriums, right? There is the Eden Sanatorium and Hospital. We have Eden Hospital still in Darjeeling. It was established in around 1882. And after, so this Eden Sanatorium and Hospital, it was mainly built to cater exclusively for the European elites. And after 5 years, they also built the Louis Jubilee Sanatorium, which is still also there in Darjeeling. This was built around in 1887, and this was meant to cater mostly the wealthy Indians. So these kind of hospitals and sanatoriums, these were built by the labor of the migrant, workers who came from Nepal and gave their labor power to build the infrastructure that the British required or the British wanted, right? So we see, how migration, it has played a very crucial role in the history of Darjeeling in the Eastern Himalayas. Like, for instance, labor migration from Nepal to Darjeeling, it primarily sort of initiated with the process of transforming Darjeeling into a hill station, and to suit the aesthetic of the European, the colonizers, right? And most of this population, they from Nepal, they came, they left the villages, they came looking for alternatives in Darjeeling for their survival, for the survival of the family, and it became sort of a norm, right? It was nothing new for people leaving their villages back in Nepal and coming and migrating and working in Darjeeling. So it became sort of a culture, and it became sort of a norm, right? So, so I have discussed the pull factors, why what pulled the labor migrants to come and work in Darjeeling. But if you had to look briefly at the push factors from Nepal, I would point out that during the initial period, the push factor was because of the result of heavy debts. There was heavy taxes that was imposed upon the marginal communities back in Nepal. There was slavery, there was bondage system, there was rigid caste system. So all of these aspects sort of built up, and it sort of pushed the Nepali population to migrate and free themselves and look alternatives in the neighboring regions like Darjeeling and Sikkim to survive. Okay? So this is just the historical aspect of labor migration, but what we see even today is that though migration started way back, centuries back, but still labor migration from Nepal to Darjeeling, Sikkim, Himalayas, it has continued over decades. So one of the primary example would be the bhariyas, the potters, the coolies that we see around in the hill towns, right? In Kalimpong, if you go to Darjeeling, if you go to Sikkim, so you see laborers, they carry different kinds of loads on their back with namlo. So these are all migrant workers coming from Nepal. Majority of them are seasonal migrants, but few of them have they are living here permanently with their family members. But I would say like more than 85% of them are still seasonal. They migrate seasonally from Nepal. I will focus on this in the later part. So we see that labor mobility, it has remained an intrinsic part of the rural household in Nepal, and there are some data which says that around 2.1 million Nepali citizens live outside the country, and they migrate for both employment as well as education, right? When we talk about labor migration between Nepal, India, we also need to look at the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1950s, right, which allows free cross-border movement of people and goods between India and Nepal, right? Though there are no official, record that talks about the exact number of Nepali migrants working in India, but as I said that, let me just check. So Nepal labor migration report of 2020 says that around 2.1 million Nepali citizens, they migrate to work or for education. They migrate outside of Nepal. But another interesting fact is that this kind of report, it does not take into account migration of less than 6 months, right? So actually it underestimates the actual number of the process, the magnitude of migration that is happening between this region, and vice versa as well. There are Nepali citizens who migrate to Nepal and work in the border areas as well. So we do not know the exact number of migrants crossing the borders every day, and how much of them are working in Nepal, or how many of them are working in India. However, there is a report that says that 58% of the migrants who work in India, they come basically in pursuit of uplifting the economic status of the family, which is the reality we all know, right? And most of these migrants, they are involved in menial and low-paying jobs in the informal sector. So informal sector means they do not have any kind of social protection, they do not have any kind of security. And migrating to India, it has become a very normal, I said norm, or it has become a culture for sustaining their lives in Nepal, right? So majority of the migrants who migrate from Nepal to the bigger cities, the metropolitan areas, they usually work as security guards, helpers, right? House helpers. They work in restaurants, hotels. They work as nannies, right? Housekeepers, etc. This is migration towards the bigger, cities and urban spaces. But the most common job taken by the Nepalese, the Nepali population migrating in the Indian Himalayas, be it the Eastern Himalayas or be it the Western Himalayas, they take up the work of potters, the bhariyas, and the coolies, right? And so they sort of manage to fit in the labor market by what locals do not usually do, and which thus it makes it a classical case of labor substitution as well. But here I'd like to point out that the Himalayan region, because of their hilly terrain, people have always been carrying loads, especially the working class section, for centuries, right? While science, it has made tremendous advances in the fields, this form of labor still sort of exists where people cannot seek help for or depend on any kind of mechanized tools, right? And these people, these migrants, they carry various kinds of loads on their backs, and they are known as coolie. So if you have to look at the origin of the term coolie, It is quite disputed, but some argue that it comes from the Tamil word kuli, kuli, which means wages or hire, and there is another term called in Urdu, which is qul, which means slave, and there is also a Turkish word which is written as quli, which means slave, and there is a Chinese word ku, which means bitter, and li means strength. So, though there is no consensus on the origin of the term or even its meaning, it is commonly understood to be hard labor, right? So, what does hard labor mean? So, it means someone who is paid to do menial work, and they are sort of hired for low or subsistence wages, right? So in the 20th century, the word kuli, it was used in the British Raj India to designate to porters, especially who worked in the railway station, right? And the term later on also gained currency in Darjeeling when it was used to denote the tea laborers in the plantations as well, and also the ones who work, who carry loads. So these terms were used to refer to these, bhariyas, or the ones who carried loads on their back. So in the context of my study as well, I have sort of used the term kuli, and I've also used the term bhariyas to sort of understand a group of migrant laborers who enter the labor market and they work as load carriers in the mountainous terrain. Okay? So this form of labor, it has existed in the Himalayan region, out of necessity. So it was ingrained in the everyday life of the individuals, of the inhabitants, who lived in the region. But one thing that has changed, once the colonial rulers, they came into the region, was that this form of labor, which was there out of, because of the necessity, it got transformed into wage labor. And here the people, they started selling the labor power, and they were getting, small amount of money for wage, right? So that is the only change that occurred once the colonial rulers, they came up in the region. And okay. So while I was also doing my research, I came, there was a dearth of literature on bhariyas, on coolies. But one of the interesting facts that I found, that these bhariyas, these coolies, they not only carried the commodities for wage, but they also carried humans. So there was something called dandi, that was also referred to as pal ki dak, which was a crucial and iconic mode of transportation in Darjeeling during the British rule. So it was a sort of, even if you Google it now, you can see that picture. So it is sort of a sedan chair in between, and there used to be two poles and four bhariyas used to carry. Someone would sit there, especially the elite, the European elites, and they used to carry. So four coolies were required to carry that dandi. And thus this carrying of, the work of carrying pottage, it not only was restricted to commodities, but it also extended to carrying individuals using other humans, right? And because of this capacity, the coolies during that time were also referred to as human horses. So in the context of porterage, I would also like to point out something which was there, which was a prominent thing during the era of Namgyal dynasty in Sikkim, which was referred to as kalo bhari. So kalo in Nepali means black, and bhari means burden or load, right? So kalo bhari, it was sort of a forced labor which was very much there, prominent in the era of Namgyal dynasty in Sikkim during the Indo-Tibet trade happened through the Silk Route, right? Especially in the early 20th century. So I think it's raining as well. So what should we do? Should I continue? It's okay. Okay, sir. Okay, so what the locals, they had to do was, they were sort of propelled to carry the loads of British consignment from India to China via Tibet. So it is also very interesting or intriguing to sort of learn how Kalo Bhari derived its name from, right? So when the British so when the British, they asked the locals to carry the consignment, which consists of various arms and ammunition. It was sent to Tibet, but it was sort of wrapped around and compactly. त्यस्तो त पढेको छैन केले गर्नु यसरी यसरी गरेर ल त्यो लुगा देऊ न त्यो लुगा बरु यसरी राख्छु नि यस्तोमा हुन्छ ओके Okay, so I'll try to wrap up fast. So since this valued possession, they had this arms and ammunition. So what the British they used to do was to safeguard the hello. To safeguard these, consignment from rain and snow of the Himalayas, they used to wrap it in cardboard and put it inside a gunny bag, and they used to paste it with black tar. And sometimes they also used to cover it with black tarpaulin. So that is how this, the whole system of carrying arms and ammunition from India to, China via Tibet, it happened. So it was termed as Kalo Bhari because it was sort of covered with black tarpaulin and sometimes with black coal or tar to give, and it got the name from there, black load or Kalo Bhari. Okay, so when we talk about this, potters in the Eastern Himalayas, we also need to sort of understand that there were two kinds of potters, right, mainly. So one was the high altitude expedition potters that the exhibition is also trying to highlight, right? These were the migrant laborers coming from Nepal and, trying to get work in the high altitude expedition as potters. And these potters were basically from the Sherpa community, or they needed to be qualified as Sherpa. And the second group of potters were the non-Sherpas, who usually got job around the low altitude, areas, and majorly they were found in the hill towns like we see today in Darjeeling and Kalimpong as well. So it is also very essential to understand the migration pattern of Sherpas from Nepal to Darjeeling for pottery work or kuli work. So initially pottery work for the Sherpa was also seasonal in nature, right? So they used to work in their agricultural field, and when there was no work in the field, they used to come here and look for various kind of wage employment. But since the turn of the 20th century, what happened was Sherpas, they were successful in getting, involved in wage labor as guides, as potters for Himalayan mountaineering expeditions. Okay, and carrying, weight among the Sherpas, however, as I said earlier, also it was more of a cultural practice, and it was a product of their, life walls long before they were sort of discovered by the colonial rulers to have the capacity to labor in the high elevations. So ethnically, these Sherpas were Tibetan groups who lived at the high altitude, regions in the Himalayan mountains of eastern Nepal, surrounding the Mount Everest, especially the Solukhumbu region. So as a result, it is said that they could sort of acclimatize and adapt at higher altitudes and making their travels up to the highest peak of the world slightly more manageable than the other communities of the Himalayan region. So Sherpas, they believed to have migrated to the Solukhumbu region in Nepal from the eastern Tibet, which is the Kham region, around the late 15th and the early 16th century, and they have been centrally engaged in the trans-Himalayan trade, and they used to bring salt from Tibet and rice, and they used to carry rice from the lower altitude regions of Nepal. So that is how they were sort of involved in the carrying of commodities, and they were they could travel up to higher altitudes carrying those kind of weights. So, but I'm also trying to point this fact because to indicate that carrying commodities uphill for them was sort of a necessity and nothing, something what they are doing extraordinarily, right? Because it was ingrained in the everyday life of this individual, the Sherpa community. So these community, they used to grow barley, they used to grow buckwheat, right? They used to raise yaks and at the height of 11,000 feet or 12,500 feet. So for these Sherpas climbing 1,800 feet and carrying, trade good, it sort of became easy because they were sort of involved in that kind of labor from the very beginning, right? Because they generally lived at 11,000 to 15,000 feet. So Sherpas later on, they began migrating to Darjeeling when they found the prospect of earning a livelihood as a wage laborer. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, some of the men, they started migrating seasonally, as I said earlier, to Darjeeling in the quest of sort of finding good economic opportunity to work under the British. So when they heard that they could get jobs of porters, they could get jobs of guides in the Darjeeling region, many young Sherpa, they came along with their wives as well, right? And by 1900 and late 1930s, 1933, a small but a regular a stream of Sherpa, they started coming down to Darjeeling, drawn by the prospect of jobs as porters, as guides, as new expedition was slowly starting. It was started around that time period, which also made the high altitude portering a Sherpa profession at the end of the day, right? So they started migrating to Darjeeling around the 1920s and 1930s. And in the late 19th century, what happened was that most Euro-American, they were barred from visiting Nepal and Tibet, right? So as an alternative, we had Darjeeling. So Darjeeling sort of became the embarkation point of the Himalayan scientific and alpine style mountaineering expedition. So it resulted in the need of high altitude porters who were capable of summiting or just moving, working with the load of the British colonial rulers. And for that, the British, they had to survey the region to find the Himalayan inhabitants who could do that work, right? But in the beginning, the British climbers, they sort of hired the Swiss and the Italian, alpine professionals to do the job of, carrying commodities and accompanying them. But since they lacked local knowledge, they were later not hired to work with the British. Then, by trial and error, what happened was that the British, they discovered the inhabitants, as a lot of literature talks about, the rightful inhabitants of this specialized niche to be the Sherpa community, the Sherpa inhabitants of the high altitude Nepal. There's a very interesting story of how Sherpa men, they were sort of interested to come to Darjeeling to work, not only because they knew that there was work of porters or there was work of guides waiting for them, but there was a particular man called Sange who had come from the Solukhumbu region and he worked in Darjeeling. And when he went back after months, several years, he was able to save so much that he built the second Sherpa monastery in Solukhumbu. So seeing that the other Sherpa people, they were sort of interested to earn that amount of money, that amount which could be able to sort of build a monastery. So they were sort of also attracted by the idea of beginning earning that kind of amount. So that is why they started coming to Darjeeling. They started working as porters, and they also sometimes were promoted to become sardars. What Angshering also was. He was a porter in the beginning, but later on he became a sardar as well, right? So that is how Sherpas, they took the high altitude porterage work, and this unskilled sort of labor, it evolved to become a skilled labor with tremendous growth in mountaineering expeditions. And because of the higher risk at this kind of work, the high altitude climbing porter job, since it was skilled, they also got better, payment, as it provided a substantial amount of, cash than the standard load bearing, the unskilled work that we see today, that the porters who carry load in the bazaar area. So compared to them, they used to get better payment. So as a result, this mountain portering became a highly eminent job compared to other coolie works of carrying luggage around the bazaar area. There's another interesting story about how the high altitude porters were recruited, right? To get recruited, of course, you needed to be a Sherpa, but also the very fact that you need to look like a Sherpa, right? For instance, there is a story where Tenzing Norgay, when he came to Darjeeling to get recruited as a porter in 1933, he was sort of rejected by Eric Shipton. And this is a very interesting story because he did not look like Sherpa. So earlier Sherpa, when they had long hair, and I think they used to make braids. But when Tenzing Norgay came to get recruited, he sort of chopped his hair. He changed his attire. So in 1933, he was not allowed, or he was not recruited for the expedition. So therefore, the colonial and of course, after he went back to Nepal, and then he sort of grew his hair back, he dressed like a Sherpa, he came back again, and he got recruited. So the colonial and the later expeditionary practices, therefore, they did not just rely on the physical ability of carrying, but also they also considered constructed identities, or the constructed appearances, that you need to look like a Sherpa to get recruited, right? So this recruitment was not purely about then strength or endurance, but it also was about fitting into a certain kind of stereotype that was created by the colonial rulers, right? Uh, so uh, so once they got recruited, the wages of this, expeditionary labor, they were typically paid at a lump sum. So at the end of the expedition, when they came back, they used to get their payment. And because of this very fact, that the Sherpa men, they could not send the remittances from the mountains to the Himalayas, right? As I said earlier, that this group of laborers were quite like neglected in the colonial writing as well. But there was another, group of individuals who were also neglected in this, research, is the women, right? So what the Sherpa men, sometimes they used to bring their women along with them. So they used to come to Darjeeling, they used to get recruited, and they used to sort of go to the expedition, but the women used to stay back. So during that period of time, the women, they used to work in the bazaar area. They used to do all sorts of work just to sustain themselves till their men came back from the expedition. So that is also that has also been shared with us by the family of Angshiring, who was porter first, then he became a sardar. So when he was in the expedition, his wife and his eldest daughters, they used to do all sorts of work. For instance, Taki Lepcha, she used to work in agricultural fields, she worked as a nanny, she used to work in the Red Cross Society to make sweaters, to make these socks and all. So these women are also very much underrepresented in the research, the writings of around labor and migration itself, right? So it sort of then explains how the culture of carrying, load for survival, it sort of got commercialized during the colonial rulers, during the colonial rule in Darjeeling. So we see that how historically Nepal, it has been a source of labor for the creation and the functioning of the Darjeelingese, right? So for instance, labor migration in the tea plantation, it stopped after some time, right? But there is the continuation of migrants coming from various regions of Nepal and working as bhariyas in the Eastern Himalayan region, in the various hill towns of the regions, right? So these bhariya labor mobility sort of, it has given continuation to the process that has initiated way back, centuries ago, right? And some of the migrants, these bhariya migrants, they have remained in Darjeeling with their families over the decades, while others, they have returned to what they call pahar, or the hill villages in Nepal. However, the culture of, this culture of coming and going of the migrants from Nepal, it has persisted in Darjeeling Hills. So when we look at the migration and labor in the Eastern Himalayas, what we really see is these people trying to make life work in tough conditions, right? Whether it's laborers moving for seasonal work, working in different hill towns, or going to the expeditions, or families crossing border to find better opportunities, whether in tea plantation or in the British Army, right? So it's all a part of the bigger story of survival and hope amidst the various challenges, amidst the low wages that they got, amidst the tough working conditions and the risks of leaving their home, right? So at the end of the day, then migration is not just about the economic aspect. It's also about the human stories, right? And it's about the courage to move, sort of the strength to work in a new place and dream of building something better. And that's what makes the Eastern Himalayan not just as a region of movement, but it also made this region a region of possibility. I think with this, I would end my session here. So if we have any comments, I would love to hear that. And maybe I've missed out some points. So maybe if we have people around who also know, who would like to share stories, so I'd like to welcome them as well. Thank you so much.